Mayday. Mayday. Control
Air
tower.
France
Do you
447 disaster.
Mayday.
June 1st,
Mayday.
2009.
Do
A
you
routine
read?
flight from
I am
Rio
in
de
the hot
Janeiro to
seat.
Paris ended in unspeakable tragedy. But what really happened aboard Air France 447? Did pilot error, faulty technology, or even fatigue play a part in one of aviation's most chilling mysteries? Buckle up as we take you on a gripping journey through the final hours of this ill-fated flight. Let's find out the truth. Did the pilots sleep off after a horrible meal? Or was something more sinister at play? Stick around to uncover it all. Would you mind subscribing to the channel already? This motivates me to bring you more engaging content. Chapter 1. The Flight That Never Landed. Under the shimmering glow of Rio de Janeiro's skyline, a journey filled with hope was about to begin. But for some aboard, it would be their last. The humid air of Rio's Galeão International Airport clung to the crowd of travelers bustling through the terminal that night. The clock ticked just past 10 p.m., and passengers of Air France Flight 447 began gathering near Gate 32.
I will love to sit beside you,
Conversations
beautiful lady.
swirled in multiple languages, French, Portuguese, English, as the diverse mix of travelers awaited their boarding call. Among them were CEOs, finance executives, families on holiday, and students eager to explore Parisian streets. A group of consultants from Sao Paulo chatted about the global economic summit awaiting them in Paris. In another corner, an elderly couple held hands, their eyes sparkling with excitement over their anniversary trip. A young musician tapped his fingers on a guitar case, dreaming of his next big gig. Outside, the night seemed perfect for flying. Galeão's long runways gleamed under soft airport floodlights, but the beauty masked hidden challenges. Located near the Atlantic, the airport was notorious for sudden weather shifts and humidity affecting takeoff conditions. That evening, a storm system loomed on the radar, far beyond the horizon. To the untrained eye, the skies seemed clear, but seasoned pilots knew such serenity could deceive. The aircraft, an Airbus A330, stood ready at the gate. Its sleek fuselage, painted in the elegant Air France colors, shimmered in the terminal lights. A technological marvel of its time, the A330 was equipped with state-of-the-art fly-by-wire systems. This was a machine designed to adapt to almost any condition, except when the sensors that fed it information were compromised. As boarding was announced, passengers filtered into the aircraft. Families wrestled with children and carry-ons. Professionals clutched briefcases filled with contracts and presentations. Smiles exchanged, laughter shared. Hope and excitement filled the air. But in the cockpit, Captain Marc Dubois and First Officer David Robert were already discussing concerns. The Tropical Convergence Zone, infamous for volatile storms, would lie in their flight path tonight. Yet, as seasoned pilots, they had seen worse. Dubois, a veteran with over 20,000 flight hours, exuded confidence. He had flown this route dozens of times. Beside him, Robert and junior co-pilot Pierre-Cedric Bonin prepared themselves, double-checking weather updates and running pre-flight diagnostics. All seemed routine, but as the ground crew finalized their checks, subtle indicators of potential issues began emerging: an unusual delay in weather updates and a slight discrepancy in sensor readings. Still, the systems reported no critical errors, no red flags. As passengers settled into their seats, laughter and murmurs filled the cabin. Flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures, their polished professionalism adding to the sense of security. The plane began taxiing to the runway. Outside, droplets of condensation kissed the windows, unnoticed by anyone on board. As the A330 accelerated down the runway, was an invisible storm already brewing, not just in the sky, but in the aircraft's systems. A path across the Atlantic. A journey of 5,546 miles awaited them, but for the crew, it would feel longer than a lifetime. Air France 447's intended flight path stretched over the Atlantic Ocean, from the vibrant shores of Rio de Janeiro to the romantic cityscape of Paris. The Airbus A330 would climb to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, passing over Brazil's northeastern coastline before venturing into the vast Atlantic. The flight would take just over 10 hours, carrying 216 passengers and 12 crew members, a standard night flight for this well-traveled route. But tonight wasn't entirely ordinary. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, a region notorious for towering thunderstorms and turbulent air, was particularly active. Though pilots were well-versed in maneuvering through such conditions, the Intertropical Convergence Zone unpredictability always required caution. Pilots relied heavily on radar systems and weather updates to chart the safest path. As the plane ascended, the lights of Rio faded behind them, and the inky blackness of the ocean stretched ahead. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was cozy. Flight attendants began serving meals, weaving between rows with practiced ease. Some passengers unwrapped blankets, ready to sleep through the flight. Others opened laptops, their screens casting faint glows in the dimly lit cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Dubois glanced at the radar display. The green arcs on the screen, the representation of storm cells, seemed manageable. The crew discussed potential deviations from their planned route, analyzing how best to navigate the turbulent zone ahead. Little did they know, the plane's critical sensors, the Pitot tubes, were silently succumbing to an insidious enemy, freezing temperatures at high altitude. The crew was unaware that the Pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, had been compromised before on other flights. Regulations mandated rigorous testing, but on this occasion, the flaw hadn't been flagged. As ice began forming on the sensors, the data they fed to the aircraft's computers would soon become erratic, an invisible trap awaiting the crew. With the aircraft cruising steadily, no one aboard could imagine the chaos lying just minutes away, hidden within the darkness of the Atlantic night, unseen threats. While passengers drifted to sleep, the very systems designed to protect them were beginning to betray the crew. By now, Air France 447 was cruising smoothly above the Atlantic. The cabin was calm, a mix of snores, hushed conversations, and the faint hum of engines. Somewhere near the rear of the plane, a teenager scribbled in a journal, dreaming of her first trip to Europe. In the first-class section, a CEO leaned back, reviewing slides for a high-stakes meeting in Paris. In the cockpit, the mood was steady but alert. Captain Dubois handed over control to his co-pilots, stepping out briefly to rest. First Officer Robert and Junior Co-Pilot Bonin monitored the instruments, chatting occasionally as they adjusted settings. The radar displayed an approaching line of storm cells, glowing green with occasional yellow streaks, manageable turbulence. Then, the first anomaly appeared, a momentary drop in indicated airspeed. Bonin frowned, watching the numbers stabilize. Just turbulence, he thought. But the instruments began flickering again, erratically jumping between readings. What the crew didn't know was that the frozen Pitot tubes were already feeding corrupted data to the flight computers. As the aircraft's autopilot relied on these readings, it disengaged automatically, leaving control in the hands of the pilots. The sudden shift went unnoticed for now. Chapter 2. A routine takeoff. A doomed journey. With the aircraft glistening in the moonlight, no one could have imagined the hidden flaws beneath its flawless exterior. The pre-flight preparations for Air France 447 were meticulously routine, or so it seemed. The Airbus A330 stood majestic at the gate, its body reflecting the soft glow of the airport floodlights. For passengers, it symbolized modern aviation at its finest, safe, reliable, and engineered to perfection. Yet behind the scenes, cracks in that illusion were already forming. Weeks before this fateful night, the A330 had undergone regular maintenance. Reports flagged minor issues, fluctuating readings in the Pitot tubes, slight discrepancies in the autopilot system's calibration, and a request for deeper diagnostics on the weather radar. However, none of these items were classified as critical. The airline, like many in the industry, had schedules to meet. After all, delays meant lost revenue and dissatisfied customers. As the ground crew performed final checks, they worked through the pre-flight checklist with robotic precision. Hydraulic systems? Operational. Landing gear? Intact. Fuel? Loaded. Yet one question hung unanswered. Had the equipment been stress-tested for the volatile Atlantic weather? It was an answer no one on the ground could definitively provide. The cockpit, meanwhile, was alive with activity. Captain Mark Dubois, a man with over a decade of flying experience, glanced over the systems with calm confidence. His crewmates, First Officer David Robert and Junior Co-Pilot Pierre-Cedric Bonin, worked methodically beside him. To the untrained eye, they exuded control. But within this trio, a subtle imbalance was present. Dubois, the eldest and most experienced, carried an unspoken authority. Bonin, the youngest, often deferred to his colleagues, while Robert took the middle ground, a peacemaker in moments of tension. Everything seemed routine, yet in the recesses of the aircraft, a silent flaw stirred. The Pitot tubes, tiny sensors responsible for measuring airspeed, were standard issue but plagued by a known defect: susceptibility to ice formation. Airbus had recommended upgrades, but the implementation across fleets had been staggered. Air France 447 sensors hadn't made the cut. The passengers were oblivious. They clinked glasses in first class, stowed luggage in economy, and exchanged stories of business trips and family vacations. A sense of calm prevailed as the boarding ramp detached. The engines roared to life, a sound synonymous with modern aviation's triumphs. The plane taxied smoothly, its tires kissing the runway with practiced ease. But as the aircraft accelerated, its pristine appearance masked an uncomfortable truth. Critical warnings from earlier reports had been downplayed. Each passing second brought the plane closer to an uncontrollable reality. As the A330 left the ground, carrying hopes and dreams skyward, did its most essential systems already harbor the seeds of disasters? Ascent to uncertainty. The first few minutes of any flight are critical. For Air France 447, they would also be the most deceptive. At 10:29 p.m., Flight 447 climbed effortlessly into the Brazilian night. The engines, powerful yet whisper-quiet, hummed with precision as the plane pierced the cloud-laden skies. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was relaxed but focused. Captain Dubois led the ascent, his steady hand guiding the plane through the first 10,000 feet. "Smooth so far," Dubois commented, adjusting the throttles. Bonin nodded, his hands busy setting autopilot parameters while Robert cross-checked fuel calculations. As per protocol, Dubois would take the lead during takeoff, ensuring the junior crew members could focus on managing systems. The cockpit displays glowed with data: altitude, airspeed, heading, all within normal ranges. Yet an anomaly lurked just out of reach. The Pitot tubes, battling freezing temperatures at high altitudes, began forming ice crystals. It was subtle at first, affecting data flow in milliseconds. But those milliseconds would compound. Meanwhile, turbulence warnings began flashing on the radar. Storm cells loomed ahead, their intensity marked in green and yellow patches. "Might need to divert slightly," Robert suggested. Dubois nodded, inputting coordinates into the navigation system. Back in the cabin, passengers remained blissfully unaware. A couple exchanged smiles over glasses of wine. A teenager scrolled through photos on his camera, capturing the city lights as they disappeared into darkness. The hum of engines lulled others to sleep. To them, the flight was unfolding like countless others before it. But as the plane continued to ascend, small fluctuations began to ripple through its systems. The Pitot tubes, now fully obstructed by ice, sent garbled readings to the flight computers. For now, the autopilot remained engaged, compensating for the irregularities. But it wouldn't last. The crew's discussions turned toward the storm. "We'll adjust course to minimize impact," Dubois instructed, his voice calm but firm. Bonin adjusted the controls, feeling a slight vibration in the yoke. "Odd," he muttered under his breath, but dismissed it quickly. This was, after all, an Airbus, a machine designed to adapt to challenges. But what happens when the very systems designed to save you begin to fail in the face of the unexpected? Warnings ignored. Sometimes, it's not the storm outside that causes the real trouble. It's the one brewing inside the systems. At 35,000 feet, Flight 447 reached cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, and the mood in the cabin lightened. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, offering refreshments and answering questions. But in the cockpit, the focus remained on the radar. The storm was closer now, its edges pulsating in sharp bursts on the display. Autopilot handling it well, Robert remarked, his eyes scanning the instruments. He couldn't know that the readings were increasingly unreliable. The Pitot tubes had reached their breaking point. Without accurate airspeed data, the autopilot's logic was beginning to falter. In less than a minute, it would disengage completely, handing full control back to the pilots. A soft chime sounded, a system alert. "What's that?" Bonin asked. Du Bois leaned forward, squinting at the display. Air speeds jumping. Could be turbulence. His voice carried the weight of experience, but there was an edge of concern. Without accurate speed data, decisions would rely solely on intuition, a dangerous game at 35,000 feet. The cockpit grew tense as Robert attempted to stabilize the readings. But the instruments now displayed conflicting information, each screen contradicting the next. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time that night, the smooth rhythm of their teamwork faltered. And then, with no warning, the autopilot disengaged. The yoke shifted, jolting Bonin's hands. "What's going on?" he exclaimed. Du Bois reached for the controls, his mind racing to assess the situation. But with corrupted data, every choice became a gamble. Chapter 3. The storm no one saw coming. Deep in the heart of the Atlantic, a monster stirred. But why couldn't the technology designed to protect the crew and passengers see it coming? The Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, is one of nature's greatest enigmas, a region where opposing trade winds collide, creating a battleground of intense storms and unpredictable weather patterns. For seasoned aviators, it's a place to be approached with caution, as towering thunderclouds can stretch over 50,000 feet into the stratosphere, unleashing torrents of rain, fierce winds, and turbulence strong enough to jolt the sturdiest aircraft. Tonight, Air France 447 was flying directly into its jaws. In the cockpit, the crew was alert but composed. Captain Marc Du Bois, seasoned by over a decade of navigating this very route, studied the weather radar. The screen showed patches of green and yellow, the telltale signs of rain and moderate turbulence. To his right, First Officer David Roberts scanned updates. "It doesn't look too severe," he commented, his tone betraying a sense of relief. But the radar had its limitations. In regions like the ITCZ, water droplets can scatter radar signals, making the storm appear less threatening than it actually is. To make matters worse, the most dangerous parts of these storms, the areas of severe updrafts and downdrafts, are often invisible to radar altogether. "Let's adjust course slightly," Du Bois said, punching coordinates into the flight management system. The slight detour was intended to bypass the densest part of the storm. However, the corrupted airspeed data from the frozen Pitot tubes had begun affecting the autopilot's precision. Du Bois didn't notice it yet, but the slight hesitations in the plane's response hinted at deeper trouble ahead. As the aircraft pressed on, the first tremors of turbulence rippled through the cabin. Passengers stirred. Drinks trembled in their cups. A mother tightened her grip on her toddler as the seatbelt signs flickered back on. Data in disarray. The first sign of failure wasn't a blaring alarm. It was silence, the kind that hides a ticking clock. In the cockpit, the pilot's conversation shifted to the increasingly unstable weather. "It's picking up," Robert muttered, adjusting the throttle slightly. The Airbus A330's autopilot was still in control, but unknown to the crew, it had begun to receive contradictory information from flight sensors. The Pitot tubes, small but essential devices located on the aircraft's exterior, had succumbed to high-altitude freezing. These sensors measure the flow of air, providing critical airspeed data to the onboard computers. Without reliable readings, the system had defaulted to a failsafe: disengage autopilot and hand control to the pilots. This shift was subtle at first, a gentle adjustment of the yoke that Bonin dismissed as turbulence. "I've got it," Bonin said, gripping the controls. The autopilot's disengagement didn't trigger an immediate alarm, but its absence created a domino effect. Without accurate airspeed data, the flight control system struggled to interpret the aircraft's true position. The storm outside wasn't just creating turbulence. It was amplifying the consequences of the technical failure. In the passenger cabin, the mood was growing tense. Overhead bins rattled, and the occasional thud of unsecured items hitting the floor echoed above the engine noise. A businessman clutched his laptop, eyes darting nervously to the windows, while a flight attendant whispered reassurances to a visibly shaken passenger. Back in the cockpit, Robert's brow furrowed as he tapped at the display. Something's not right. Airspeed is fluctuating again. Du Bois leaned forward, studying the instruments. Switch to manual, he instructed. His voice was calm, but beneath the surface, his mind raced to decipher the root of the problem. The A330 was designed to be pilot-friendly, but without reliable data, even the most experienced aviator would face an uphill battle. The pilots were flying blind in the world's most unforgiving skies. What critical mistake would come next? The storm within. As chaos loomed outside the aircraft, a more dangerous storm was brewing inside the cockpit. The cockpit of Flight 447 had transformed into a hive of activity. Bonin, gripping the controls tightly, felt the yoke resist his inputs. "It's not responding like it should," he said, his voice tinged with unease. Robert, seated beside him, glanced at the display. The airspeed indicator had vanished entirely, replaced by a series of dashes, a clear sign that the Pitot tubes had failed completely. "Manual thrust," Du Bois commanded, taking over from Bonin. The Airbus A330 was designed to handle emergencies like these, but it relied heavily on pilots maintaining composure under pressure. With unreliable airspeed data, the crew's training was being tested to its limits. Outside the cockpit, the storm intensified. Winds battered the fuselage, and rain lashed against the windows with relentless force. The aircraft jolted violently as it entered a pocket of severe turbulence. In the cabin, cries of alarm pierced the air. Flight attendants scrambled to reassure passengers, but even their calm expressions couldn't mask the growing fear. In the cockpit, the crew's communication became strained. Du Bois barked instructions while Robert and Bonin attempted to implement them. But confusion over the aircraft's true state led to conflicting actions. The A330, caught between conflicting inputs, began to climb steeply, a dangerous move in turbulent conditions. "We're stalling," Bonin exclaimed, his voice rising in panic. But without reliable airspeed data, the true cause of the aircraft's behavior remained unclear. Du Bois attempted to take control, but the growing tension in the cockpit made effective teamwork nearly impossible. Chapter 4. The Ticking Clock of Chaos. It started as a routine flight correction, but the events of the next 3 minutes would seal the fate of Flight 447. The cockpit of Air France 447 was a flurry of activity. Junior co-pilot Pierre-Cedric Bonin, gripping the controls tightly, attempted to stabilize the aircraft. The autopilot had disengaged, leaving manual control in the hands of the flight crew. Beside him, First Officer David Roberts scanned the instruments, his eyes darting between the altitude, vertical speed, and now erratic airspeed indicators. "What's going on with the airspeed?" Bonin asked, his voice betraying rising anxiety. The instruments were feeding contradictory information. The Pitot tubes, iced over and unable to send accurate airspeed data, had thrown the flight systems into chaos. Robert glanced over, the speeds fluctuating. "We're losing control here." His hands hovered over the thrust levers, unsure whether to increase or reduce power. Captain Marc Du Bois, returning from a brief rest, entered the cockpit. He took one look at the situation and immediately understood the gravity of their predicament. "Why is the plane climbing?" Du Bois asked sharply. The aircraft, caught between conflicting inputs from the pilots and erroneous sensor data, had begun a dangerous ascent. In aviation, this is known as a high-altitude stall, a situation where the plane loses lift and risks plummeting. Bonin's voice was panicked. "I'm pulling back, trying to stabilize." His inexperience showed as he held the yoke in a full upward position, worsening the stall conditions. Du Bois raised his voice. "Don't pull up. Push the nose down." But amidst the confusion and alarm tones, clear communication was elusive. Seconds were ticking by, and with every passing moment, the aircraft drifted further from recovery. Could they regain control, or was the stall spiraling beyond savings? Spiraling downward. Panic in the cockpit. Alarms blaring. But was it too late to recover from the stall? The cockpit voice recorder captured the chaotic interplay of human emotions and technical challenges. "Stall! Stall!" blared the computer's synthetic voice, an automated warning indicating that the aircraft's wings were no longer generating sufficient lift. The message repeated, drowning out the pilots' voices. Du Bois grabbed the yoke. "Bonin, let go. We need to descend." His voice was firm, but the stress was palpable. Bonin, inexperienced in crisis management, hesitated. "I thought we were too low." "You're wrong," Du Bois interrupted. He quickly assessed the altitude. They were at 38,000 feet, but the climbing motion had caused the engines to struggle, and speed had dropped dramatically. Robert tried to clarify. "We're in a stall. We have to pitch down to regain speed," but the lack of reliable airspeed readings created a deadly conundrum. How fast were they falling? Were they accelerating? Or were the instruments lying entirely? The storm outside made matters worse. Winds buffeted the aircraft, and visibility was non-existent. Du Bois barked instructions, but in the turbulence, his commands felt more like desperate pleas. The A330 was designed to assist pilots in emergencies, but its systems relied on accurate data the frozen Pitot tubes couldn't provide. Without a cohesive plan, the pilots made conflicting adjustments. Du Bois tried to take charge, but Bonin, gripped by fear, continued to hold the nose up, counteracting Du Bois's inputs. With the stall worsening and communication breaking down, had they reached the point of no return? The deadly implications of stalling. In aviation, a stall isn't just a loss of speed, it's the beginning of a battle against gravity itself. For a commercial aircraft like the Airbus A330, stalling at high altitude is one of the most dangerous scenarios. At 38,000 feet, the air is thin, and recovering from a stall requires precise maneuvers. The key is simple in theory. Push the nose down to gain speed, then level out. But in practice, the psychological pressure and conflicting data make it anything but simple. "Pitch down," Du Bois repeated, his hands steady on the controls. But Bonin's instincts betrayed him. Years of training taught pilots to avoid rapid descents at all costs, especially over water. "I'm afraid we'll hit the ocean," Bonin cried, still pulling back on the yoke. Robert intervened, attempting to override Bonin's control. "We have altitude. We need speed. Trust me." But Bonin's grip remained firm, and the plane continued to climb in defiance of physics. Outside, the storm raged, masking the gravity of the situation from the passengers. In the cabin, nervous murmurs turned into outright panic as the turbulence became more severe. Flight attendants clung to their seats, their usual calm replaced with fear. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the reality was sinking in. The A330 was locked in a deadly stall. The engines, still producing thrust, couldn't overcome the angle of attack. The plane was essentially falling through the sky, its nose pointed upward in defiance of logic. "Engines are fine. Thrust is fine. This is us," Du Bois admitted, his voice filled with frustration. "Bonin, let go of the yoke. That's an order." Bonin hesitated. Then, finally, his hands released. Du Bois pitched the nose downward slightly, but by now, critical altitude had been lost. The time for recovery was rapidly Chapter 5, into the depths of the Atlantic. 2 years after the disappearance, the wreckage of Flight 447 still lay hidden. But the ocean, as vast as it is merciless, would not yield its secrets easily. When Air France 447 vanished into the depths of the Atlantic on June 1st, 2009, It left behind one of the greatest mysteries in modern aviation history. In the days following the disaster, search teams scoured a search area spanning thousands of square miles, hoping to locate the aircraft's black boxes. Yet, the sheer depth of the ocean, plunging to over 13,000 feet in the region of the crash, proved a formidable adversary. The first signs of the wreckage were discovered within days. Floating debris, life vests, and, most heartbreakingly, human remains. However, the critical flight data recorders remained elusive. These devices, known as the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, and Cockpit Voice Recorder, CVR, are designed to survive extreme conditions. But even they seem to have disappeared into the abyss. The recovery mission evolved into a technological arms race. Submersibles equipped with advanced sonar and remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, were deployed to map the seafloor. Each sweep of the ocean yielded tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. Months turned into years, and hope began to wane. Finally, in 2011, the breakthrough came. An advanced sonar vehicle, capable of scanning vast stretches of the seafloor, detected unusual shapes buried under layers of sediment. The data matched the size and contours of an Airbus A330 fuselage. Recovery operations began immediately. Deep-sea ROVs descended into the darkness, and after painstaking work, they unearthed the wreckage and the black boxes. With the black boxes in hand, investigators prepared to piece together the truth. But what they discovered would shock the aviation world. Voices from the past. When the cockpit voice recorder was recovered, it held the final moments of Air France 447, a window into 3 minutes of chaos. The black boxes were flown to France, where investigators from the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BA, began the delicate process of extracting their data. Every second of the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, was painstakingly analyzed. The conversations, commands, and alarms captured in those 3 minutes painted a harrowing picture of confusion and miscommunication. Stall. Stall. The automated warning repeated relentlessly, a chilling reminder of the pilot's plight. Captain Marc Dubois could be heard giving instructions, his voice firm but strained. Junior co-pilot Bonin, inexperienced and overwhelmed, responded with fragmented acknowledgments. First Officer Robert attempted to mediate, but the chaos rendered clear communication nearly impossible. The recordings revealed a tragic pattern. In their attempt to stabilize the aircraft, Bonin had pulled the yoke upward, causing the plane to climb further into the stall. Dubois's orders to lower the nose were delayed by precious seconds as the crew grappled with contradictory readings. It became evident that the stall warnings, though accurate, were misinterpreted in the fog of panic. Simultaneously, the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, painted a stark technical picture. The frozen Pitot tubes, the root cause of the incorrect airspeed readings, had triggered a cascade of system failures. Without accurate data, the autopilot had disengaged, leaving the pilots reliant on manual inputs. This exposed a troubling reality. Over-reliance on automation had left the crew underprepared for such a scenario. The evidence was mounting, but the question remained: was this a failure of the machine, the men, or both? Lessons written in blood. The final report on Air France 447 didn't just explain what went wrong. It rewrote the rules of modern aviation. The findings of the BEA investigation sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. While the frozen Pitot tubes were the initial trigger, they were far from the sole cause. The report identified 3 key factors: inadequate pilot training, over-reliance on automation, and a failure to properly address known hardware vulnerabilities. First, the pilot's actions came under scrutiny. Although Captain Dubois was experienced, he had been resting during the critical moments leading up to the stall. Junior co-pilot Bonin, who had taken control, lacked the training to properly identify and respond to a high-altitude stall. His decision to pull the nose up, while instinctive, proved fatal. Second, the report highlighted the over-reliance on automation. The A330's fly-by-wire systems were designed to handle the majority of in-flight challenges. But when the systems failed due to the Pitot tube icing, the pilots were unprepared for the manual demands of recovery. Finally, Airbus faced criticism for its design choices. Although the Pitot tube issue was a known vulnerability, the upgrades to address it had not been implemented fleet-wide. Air France 447 sensors were of an older model, more prone to freezing. The report called for sweeping changes in both equipment design and maintenance protocols. In response, the aviation industry acted swiftly. Airbus redesigned its Pitot tubes, and airlines worldwide revised pilot training programs to include high-altitude stall recovery. Regulations were updated to ensure that critical hardware upgrades were implemented across all fleets. Air France 447 changed aviation forever. But as the families of the victims sought answers, another question lingered. Who was truly responsible, and at what cost? Chapter 6. Lessons learned from tragedy. They say experience is the best teacher, but for the aviation world, experience came at the cost of 228 lives. In the aftermath of the Air France 447 disaster, global aviation authorities faced a sobering realization. The industry had become overly reliant on automation, and pilots were losing touch with fundamental flying skills. The BEA investigation revealed that the crew's inability to recognize and recover from a high-altitude stall was a key factor in the crash. The report sent shockwaves through the aviation community, spurring immediate calls for change. At the heart of the reforms was pilot training. Traditionally, training programs focused on operating automated systems, assuming that human intervention would rarely be needed. But the tragedy of AF 447 highlighted the flaws in this approach. New protocols were introduced, emphasizing manual flying skills and stall recovery techniques. Simulators were reprogrammed to replicate high-altitude scenarios, forcing pilots to practice under conditions that mirrored those of AF 447's final moments. Airlines also revised fatigue management policies. Investigators found that Captain Marc Dubois had been nearing the end of his rest period when the crisis began, raising questions about alertness. Flight scheduling was overhauled to ensure adequate rest periods for all crew members, minimizing the risk of fatigue-induced errors. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, took the lead in standardizing these changes. Airlines across the globe were mandated to incorporate enhanced training programs, creating a new generation of pilots better equipped to handle emergencies. The reforms were met with a mix of relief and regret. Relief that future incidents could be prevented, but regret that these changes had come too late for the passengers of Flight 447. As pilots prepared for a new era of aviation, the question loomed, would these lessons truly prevent another tragedy? Justice and compensation. For the families of the victims, closure came not in the form of answers, but in the fight for justice. The loss of 228 lives left a ripple effect of grief and anger. Families of the victims, hailing from over 30 countries, like United States, Canada, United Kingdom etc., demanded accountability. Lawsuits were filed against Air France and Airbus, accusing them of negligence. The airlines faced scrutiny for not updating the Pitot tubes, despite knowing their vulnerabilities in icy conditions. Airbus, too, was criticized for not enforcing fleet-wide changes more urgently. The legal battle was long and arduous. Courts debated whether the fault lay with the pilots, the manufacturers, or the airline itself. In the end, settlements were reached, with compensation provided to the victims' families. While the exact amounts varied, the settlements aimed to cover not only the emotional toll, but also the financial hardships caused by the loss of loved ones. But for many families, no monetary amount could fill the void. Advocacy groups emerged, campaigning for stricter aviation safety regulations. These families became the voice of change, ensuring that their loved ones' deaths would not be in vain. Meanwhile, the airline industry faced broader implications. Public trust in air travel had been shaken. Airlines doubled down on transparency, introducing regular updates about safety measures to reassure passengers. Air France implemented a fleet-wide overhaul, replacing outdated components and enhancing maintenance protocols. With justice served and safety measures strengthened, one question remained. Could passengers truly feel safe again? A safer sky for tomorrow. The crash of AF 447 became a watershed moment in aviation history. The changes it inspired reshaped the way airlines operate, from the cockpit to the boardroom. Airbus re-engineered its Pitot tubes, introducing models resistant to high-altitude freezing. Regulators mandated their installation across all fleets, leaving no room for oversight. The industry also embraced technological advancements. New aircraft designs incorporated redundancy systems, ensuring that failures in one area wouldn't compromise the entire flight. Communication between pilots and air traffic control was improved, with satellite-based systems providing real-time updates even over remote areas like the Atlantic. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Airlines began fostering a greater emphasis on teamwork and communication within the cockpit. The concept of crew resource management was revitalized, teaching pilots to manage stress, prioritize tasks, and collaborate effectively during crises. Public confidence in air travel, while shaken, began to recover. As passengers boarded flights, they did so with the assurance that lessons from AF 447 had been woven into every aspect of their journey. Safety videos, often dismissed as routine, now carried a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, the aviation world knew that no system could be foolproof. Accidents, though rare, are an inevitable part of progress. As one aviation expert put it, safety is not a destination, it's a journey. And AF 447 reminded us of the cost of complacency. The skies may be safer, but the ultimate question lingers. Could a tragedy like this happen again? If you love the story, please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification button. This motivates me to bring you more engaging content.